I'm standing in front of the judge, my hands trembling on the dark wood table. My son, Ryan, is pointing his finger at me as if I were a stranger, as if I hadn't spent entire nights watching over him when he had a fever, as if I hadn't given up my own dreams so he could achieve his. "This old woman just knows how to waste what she doesn't deserve," he says with a voice I don't recognize, a voice full of venom I never thought I'd hear from my own child. Judge Gregory nods slightly as he reviews the papers in front of him, and Ryan's lawyer, a woman in a gray power suit who has looked at me with contempt since I entered this room, smiles as if she's already won. I feel the floor moving beneath my feet. I am 72 years old, and I never imagined I would end up here, in a courtroom, facing the only child I brought into this world, listening to him demand every penny of the fortune my husband, Arthur, left me when he closed his eyes for the last time 6 months ago. But what none of them know, what not even my own son suspects, is that I am about to say 3 words that will change everything. 3 words that will make the judge go pale and leave Ryan completely silent. If you have ever felt betrayed by your own family, if someone you loved with all your heart ever turned their back on you for money, then you need to hear what happened next. Because this story isn't just mine. It belongs to all the mothers who have been judged, despised, and forgotten by the children they raised. 6 months ago, my life was completely different. Arthur was still alive, though weak, fighting the cancer that was stealing his strength day by day. We were happy, despite everything. 45 years of marriage had taught us that true love isn't measured in good days, but in how you face the bad days together. Arthur was a man with hard-working hands and a noble heart. When we got married, he had nothing but an old pickup truck and an impossible dream, to build his own trucking company. I worked cleaning houses to help him pay for gas. We ate macaroni and cheese from a box for months to save every penny. But we did it, with sacrifice, with sleepless nights, with every drop of sweat. We built something from nothing. The company grew. 1 truck became 2, then 5, then 20. We employed 50 families. We bought this house where we raised Ryan, where we celebrated every birthday, every Christmas, every important moment of our lives. Ryan was our pride and joy. We gave him everything we never had: education in good schools, new clothes, vacations, opportunities. Arthur always said he worked so hard, so our son would never have to go through what we went through. And Ryan was a good son, affectionate, respectful, attentive. He came to visit us every week. He would hug me and say, "Mom, you're the best." Arthur and I would look at each other with those eyes that only parents understand, those eyes that say, "We did it. We raised a good man." Everything changed 3 years ago. Ryan met Genevieve at a business conference. She was elegant, well-dressed, always in high heels and expensive perfume. From the first day he brought her home, I knew something wasn't right. The way she looked at our house, as if she were evaluating how much everything was worth. The way she spoke to me, with that false politeness that hides contempt. But Ryan was in love. Or at least, he thought he was. They got married 6 months after they met. Arthur squeezed my hand during the ceremony and whispered, "I hope we're wrong about her." I nodded, even though my heart knew we weren't. Ryan's visits started to become less frequent. First, he'd come every 2 weeks, then once a month, then only on special occasions. He always had an excuse: work, traffic, commitments with Genevieve's family. When he did come, she came with him, and her eyes continued to evaluate, calculate, measuring the value of every object in our house. Then Arthur got sick. The diagnosis was devastating: pancreatic cancer, advanced stage. The doctors gave us 6 months, maybe a year if we were lucky. I called Ryan, crying. I needed my son. I needed his father to see him before it was too late. Ryan came, but Genevieve stayed in the car. "She's allergic to hospitals," he explained. I didn't say anything, but Arthur looked at me with those tired eyes that could still see the truth better than anyone. During those last few months, I cared for Arthur with every fiber of my being. I gave him his medicine, bathed him when he could no longer do it himself, read him his favorite books, held his hand during the nights of pain. Ryan would come to visit, but less and less. Always with Genevieve, always looking at his watch, always with Genevieve waiting for him somewhere. One afternoon, 2 weeks before Arthur died, My husband asked me to call his lawyer, Ruth. She was an older woman, a friend of the family for decades. Arthur was closed in our study with her for 2 hours. I waited outside, listening to the murmur of their voices through the door. When Ruth came out, her eyes were damp. She hugged me and said, "Margaret, your husband is a wise man. Trust him, even when he's no longer here." I didn't understand what she meant, but I nodded anyway. Arthur died at home, in our bed, with my hand in his. His last words were, "Forgive me for what's coming, my love, but it was necessary. Protect her." Ruth. I didn't understand. I just cried and held his body until it grew cold. The funeral was packed. 50 families who depended on the company came to say goodbye to the man who had given them work and dignity. Ryan was there, dressed in black, with Genevieve at his side wearing a wine-colored dress that seemed too flashy for a funeral. He didn't cry. Not a single tear for the father who had given him everything. A week after the funeral, Ruth came to the house with a thick folder full of documents. I sat on the same sofa where Arthur and I had watched so many movies together, where we had planned our future, where we had grown old holding hands. "Margaret, I need to read you Arthur's will," Ruth said in a soft but firm voice. I nodded, preparing myself to hear what I already imagined. Everything would be left to me, and eventually to Ryan when I was gone. But there was something else. Something Arthur had written in his own hand on the last pages of the will. Ruth read slowly, as if each word weighed a ton. "I leave all my assets, the company, the properties, and the bank accounts in a trust, managed by my wife Margaret, until such time as she deems appropriate. My son Ryan will receive his inheritance only when he demonstrates the character, honor, and respect I tried to teach him his entire life." I froze. "What does this mean?" Ruth looked me straight in the eye. "It means Arthur knew something you didn't want to see. He loved Ryan, but he didn't trust the people around him. This clause protects everything you built together. There was more. A special clause that Ruth didn't read aloud that day. She just told me it existed. There are specific conditions under which Ryan would lose all right to the inheritance forever. Arthur was very clear about it. Let's hope we never have to get to that point. I didn't tell Ryan any of this when he came for the official reading of the will 3 days later. He only heard that I would manage everything and that he would receive his share at the appropriate time. I saw his face tighten. I saw how Genevieve pressed her lips together until they turned white, but they didn't say anything that day. Not yet. I tried to go on with my life. The house felt empty without Arthur. Every corner reminded me of him. His coffee mug was still in the same place he left it the last morning he was able to get up. His favorite shirt hung in the closet. Sometimes I would wake up at night and reach out for his warmth, only to find cold sheets. Ryan stopped visiting me completely. When I called him, he always had an excuse. "I'm really busy, Mom. We have plans, Mom. Next week. I promise, Mom." But next week never came. 2 months after the funeral, I got a call from Ryan. "Mom, Genevieve and I want to invite you to dinner at our house. We need to talk about some things." My heart leaped with hope. Maybe my son finally wanted to reconnect with me. Maybe the pain of losing his father had made him reflect. I arrived at their house with an apple pie I had baked myself, Ryan's favorite since he was a kid. I rang the doorbell with a smile, imagining that maybe we could be a family again. Genevieve opened the door. She didn't smile. "Come in," she said curtly. The house was immaculate, decorated with expensive modern furniture. Everything was white, gray, and black. Cold. Lifeless. Without the family photographs, I always thought my son would hang on his walls. Ryan was sitting in the living room with a glass of wine in his hand. "Hey, Mom," he said, without getting up to hug me. I set the pie on the coffee table. No one touched it all night. Dinner was tense. Genevieve barely spoke to me. Ryan ate in silence, staring at his plate as if the answers to all his questions were written in the food. I tried to make conversation. I asked about his work, about his plans, about how they were handling the loss of Arthur. "That's precisely what we want to talk about," Genevieve said, dropping her fork onto her plate with a sharp clink. "About Arthur's money." My heart started to beat faster. "Money?" I asked, pretending not to understand. "Don't play dumb, Margaret," she continued, with a tone that made me feel like I was 5 years old and being scolded. We know Arthur left a considerable fortune. The company is worth millions of dollars. The properties, the bank accounts. And you have all of it. Genevieve, please, Ryan intervened weakly, but without real conviction. She ignored him. Ryan is the only son, the rightful heir. It's not fair that you, a woman your age, who never really worked, who was just a stay-at-home mom, control all that money. I felt as if I'd been slapped. Who never worked, I repeated in a trembling voice. I cleaned houses for years so Arthur could buy his first truck. I raised your husband. I kept this home running while Arthur built his company. That's not a real job, Genevieve said with disdain. Anyone can clean and cook. What Arthur built was thanks to his intelligence and effort, not yours. And now you, an old woman who probably doesn't even know how to use a computer, are going to waste everything he achieved. I looked at Ryan, waiting for him to defend me, waiting for him to tell his wife she was out of line, that she was disrespecting me. But my son just stared at his wine glass, swirling it slowly between his fingers. Ryan, I said in a broken voice, do you think the same thing? He finally looked up. I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. It wasn't hatred. It was worse. It was indifference. As if I were an obstacle in his path, a problem he needed to solve. Mom, be reasonable, he said in a tired voice. You don't need all that money. You live alone in that huge house. You have no real expenses. What do you need millions of dollars for? I have plans, projects, ideas to expand the business. I can grow the company, multiply what Dad built. Your father left very clear instructions, I replied, feeling tears start to well up, but refusing to cry in front of them. He knew what he was doing. Genevieve let out a bitter laugh. Of course he knew. He knew you manipulated him on his deathbed when he was weak and confused from the medication. You convinced him to leave you everything. I stood up from the chair so quickly it nearly fell over. I am not going to stay here and listen to this. Arthur was perfectly lucid when he made his will, and he did it to protect his legacy. Protect it from whom? Genevieve shouted, also standing up. From his own son? You are a selfish and manipulative woman, Margaret. A leech who lived her whole life off her husband, and now plans to keep everything he earned with his own effort. I left that house with my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. I didn't even take the pie I had baked with so much love. I drove home, crying so hard I could barely see the road. Genevieve's words echoed in my head like bells. Leech, manipulator, old woman wasting money. And the worst part of all was that Ryan hadn't said a word to defend me. My own son had let me be humiliated in his own home. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat on the bed I had shared with Arthur for 45 years, looking at his photograph on the nightstand. Why did you do this? I asked his smiling image. Why did you put these conditions in the will? You knew this would happen. But photographs don't answer, and the dead keep their secrets forever. The following weeks were a silent hell. Ryan called once to apologize for Genevieve's behavior, but his words sounded hollow, rehearsed. She was stressed, Mom. She didn't mean those things. But you have to understand our position. We need that money. We have plans. Investments. You can't be so selfish as to keep everything just because Dad left it to you. Your father left it to me for a reason, I replied, feeling something inside me harden, as if every cruel word were building a stone wall around my heart. And when the time is right, you will receive what you're owed. Ryan sighed with frustration. And when will that be? When you're 90? When I'm too old to enjoy it? It's not fair, Mom. He hung up without saying goodbye. I stood there with the phone in my hand, listening to the dial tone as if it were the sound of my heart breaking over and over. I tried to distract myself by managing the company. Ruth helped me understand the numbers, the contracts, the daily operations. I discovered that Arthur had been more meticulous than I imagined. Every document was perfectly organized, every decision backed by detailed analysis. The company wasn't just successful, it was solid as a rock. But I also discovered something disturbing. There were outstanding invoices in Ryan's name, loans that Arthur had quietly paid off over the last 2 years. $30,000 here, $50,000 there, all marked personal loan to Ryan. Confidential. My son had been borrowing money from his father, and I never knew. Why did Arthur never tell me? I asked Ruth, pointing to the documents with a trembling hand. She sighed deeply. Because he knew you, Margaret. He knew you would defend Ryan, no matter what. Arthur wanted to protect you from the truth, as much as he wanted to protect his company. That's why he put those clauses in the will. He saw something you didn't want to see. That night, I sat in Arthur's study and went through every document, every email he had saved, every note he had written. And there it was, hidden among business papers, a letter addressed to me. My name written in his shaky handwriting from his last days. I opened it with hands that couldn't stop trembling. My dearest Margaret, it began. If you are reading this, it means I'm no longer with you, and it probably means Ryan is pressuring you for the money. Forgive me for not telling you sooner, but our son has problems that I tried to solve in silence. He has gambling debts, Margaret. Big ones. For 2 years I've been paying them off secretly, hoping he would mature, that he would leave those vices behind. But every time I paid one off, another appeared. Genevieve knows. In fact, I think she encourages him. I've done some research and found that she also has debts, from credit cards, from personal loans. They got married not for love, but because they both needed money and thought I was an inexhaustible source. I had to stop because tears were blurring my vision. My son, my little Ryan, who had been so innocent, so pure. How had it come to this? I continued reading, my heart broken. I didn't tell you anything because I know how much you love our son. I know you would have sold everything, mortgaged our house, left yourself with nothing just to save him. But, Margaret, there are people who don't want to be saved. There are people who just want more and more until they destroy everything. That's why I made the will this way. To protect you, to protect what we built together, and to give Ryan one last chance to show who he really is. If he comes to you with humility, with respect, with true love, then you will know my son still exists inside that man. But if he comes with lawyers, with demands, with cruelty, then you will know we lost him a long time ago. In that case, Margaret, show no mercy. Activate the special clause in the will. Ruth knows what to do. Protect our legacy. Protect the 50 families who depend on the company. And above all, protect yourself. I love you beyond death. Forever yours, Arthur. I cried for hours, holding that letter to my chest. Arthur had known everything. He had seen the future with a clarity that I, blinded by my mother's love, never had. And now he had left me with an impossible decision: believe in my son or believe in my husband. 3 months after the funeral, while I was still processing the truth about Ryan, while I was still torn between my love as a mother and the reality Arthur had seen, the final blow came. A yellow envelope delivered by a courier. Inside was a court summons. Ryan was suing me. He wasn't asking for a part of the inheritance. He wasn't suggesting a negotiation. He was demanding everything. Absolutely everything. The company, the properties, the bank accounts, even the house where I had raised him. And his legal argument was devastating. I was an elderly woman, mentally incompetent, incapable of managing a company, and he was the rightful heir who had been unjustly stripped of his rights by a will written under undue influence. I sat on the living room floor with that summons in my hands, and I felt as if the world had stopped. My son didn't just want to take the money. He wanted to declare me incompetent. He wanted to humiliate me publicly. He wanted to destroy me. I called Ruth immediately. She came to the house that same afternoon with an expression that mixed sadness and determination. I knew this would happen, she said, sitting across from me. Arthur warned me. That's why we drafted the will in that specific way. Margaret, do you remember the special clause I mentioned? I nodded weakly. It's time you knew all of it, Ruth continued, opening her briefcase and taking out another document. Arthur wrote this: if my son Ryan legally attempts to take what I have left my wife, if he sues her, if he takes her to court, if he tries to declare her incompetent or in any way use the law to strip her of her inheritance, then he automatically forfeits all right to receive any part of my estate. Not only does he lose his future inheritance, but he is explicitly excluded forever. In that case, my wife has complete authority to dispose of all assets as she deems appropriate, including donations, sales, or any other action that protects the legacy we built together. The silence that followed Ruth's words was so deep I could hear my own heart beating. "You're saying that if I go to that court, Ryan loses everything automatically?" I asked in a barely audible voice. Ruth nodded slowly. "Exactly. Arthur knew that if your son went to the extreme of suing you, it meant there was nothing left of the man you raised. This was his way of giving you definitive proof, and it was also his way of protecting the company and everything he built." I got up and walked to the window, looking at the garden Arthur and I had planted together so many years ago. The rose bushes he pruned every spring were now growing wild, without his careful hand. "And what if I don't go to court?" I asked without turning around. "What if I just give him what he's asking for?" "Then you would betray your husband's final wish," Ruth replied firmly. "And you would allow Ryan and Genevieve to destroy in months what took you decades to build?" "Margaret, I've done some digging. I know why they need so much money so desperately. Your son has gambling debts of over $200,000. Genevieve has credit card balances totaling another $150,000. Together, they owe so much that if you give them the company, they will sell it off in pieces to pay their creditors. The 50 families who depend on those jobs will be left on the street." That information hit me like a fist to the stomach. It wasn't just about Ryan and me. There were 50 families who trusted the company to keep running, fathers who fed their children with those salaries, mothers who paid for school and medicine. Did I have the right to sacrifice all of that to save a son who clearly didn't want to be saved? "I need to think," I told Ruth. She put her hand on my shoulder kindly. "You have 2 weeks before the hearing. But Margaret, you need to know something else. I've hired a private investigator. What he discovered about Genevieve is disturbing." She took a folder from her briefcase and left it on the table. "This explains a lot. Read it when you're ready." After Ruth left, I stared at that folder for hours, not daring to open it. Part of me didn't want to know anymore. Part of me wanted to keep believing that maybe this was all a terrible misunderstanding, that my son was still in there somewhere, trapped but not lost. Finally, when night had completely fallen, I opened the folder. What I read chilled my blood. Genevieve had been married before, twice. Both marriages had ended after she emptied her husband's bank accounts. The first had been an older businessman, the second a successful lawyer. In both cases, the pattern was the same. She would marry, take control of the finances bit by bit, accumulate debts in their names, and then disappear with whatever she could carry before they realized what was happening. There were photographs in the report. Genevieve at casinos, signing large checks. Genevieve with a man who was not Ryan, entering expensive hotels. Dates and places that corresponded to the last 6 months, after Arthur had died. My daughter-in-law hadn't just manipulated my son into suing me. She was cheating on him while she did it. The question that tormented me was, should I tell Ryan the truth about his wife? Or should I let life teach him the lesson he clearly needed to learn? Arthur would have known what to do. Arthur always knew what to say, how to act. But Arthur was gone, and I had to make this decision alone. I spent those 2 weeks in constant agony. Every time the phone rang, I hoped it would be Ryan, calling to apologize, to say he had made a terrible mistake, that he would drop the lawsuit. But he never called. Not once. My son had decided his path, and that path ran right through me as if I were an unimportant obstacle. I tried calling him. 3 times I dialed his number, and 3 times I hung up before it rang. What would I say? "Please don't do this to me? I still love you despite everything? Your father knew this would happen, and that's why he left you out of the will?" Nothing seemed right. Everything seemed desperate and weak. The 4th time I dialed, I let it ring. Genevieve answered. "What do you want, Margaret?" she asked in that cold tone that was now so familiar. "I need to talk to my son," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Your son is busy preparing for the trial where he will finally get back what rightfully belongs to him." "Genevieve, please," I begged, hating myself for pleading but unable to stop it. "It doesn't have to be this way. We can sit down. Talk like a family." She laughed, a cruel laugh that cut me like glass. "Family? You stopped being family the day you decided to steal the money that belonged to Ryan. See you in court, old woman. And prepare to lose everything." She hung up. I stood there, holding the phone, feeling the last hopes of reconciliation vanish like smoke. There was no going back. Ryan had made his choice, and I would have to make mine. The night before the hearing, I took out Arthur's letter again and read it all the way through. This time, I didn't cry. This time, I felt something different growing inside me. It wasn't hatred or revenge. It was clarity. Arthur had left me this test knowing exactly what would happen. He had seen something in Ryan that I had refused to see. Weakness, greed, a lack of character, and he had given me the tools to protect myself. "It's okay, my love," I told Arthur's photograph that night. "I'll do what you asked. I will protect our legacy, and I will let Ryan face the consequences of his decisions." I slept better that night than I had in 3 months. For the first time since Arthur died, I felt I wasn't completely alone. He had foreseen this. He had prepared me, and now it was my turn to honor his final wish. The morning of the hearing, I put on a pearl-colored dress that Arthur always said made me look dignified and strong. I did my makeup carefully, not to hide my age, but to show that a 72-year-old woman could have all the dignity and strength in the world. I looked in the mirror and saw someone who had survived 45 years of marriage, who had built an empire from scratch with her husband, who had raised a son with all her love. That woman was not weak. That woman was not incompetent. And that woman was not going to let herself be destroyed without a fight. Ruth picked me up early. In the car, we went over the strategy. "Ryan is going to try to paint you as a senile old woman who knows nothing about business. They're going to bring in false witnesses. They're going to manipulate numbers. They're going to do everything they can to make you look incompetent." "And what do we do?" I asked, feeling the nerves start to climb my spine. Ruth looked at me with a small but determined smile. "We let them bury themselves. We let them present their case, tell all their lies, show exactly who they are. And when it's your turn to speak, you will simply tell the truth. The truth that Arthur left in writing, the truth that none of them know yet." We arrived at the courthouse a half-hour early. The building was imposing, with tall columns and hallways that echoed with every step. I sat on a polished wooden bench, waiting, feeling every minute stretch into an eternity. And then I saw them arrive. Ryan entered first, dressed in a black suit that made him look like a stranger. This wasn't the boy I had raised, the young man who used to hug me and tell me I was the best mom in the world. This was a man I didn't recognize, with hard eyes and a clenched jaw. Behind him came Genevieve, wearing an ivory-colored dress and heels so high they clicked against the marble floor. She looked at me with a triumphant smile, as if she had already won. Their lawyer was a tall, severe woman with black hair cut in an aggressive style, carrying an expensive leather briefcase and an expression that said she never lost a case. She introduced herself as Miss Shaw, an estate litigation specialist. She shook my hand with a cold, calculating grip. Ryan didn't look at me, not even once. He walked past me as if I were invisible, as if I weren't the woman who had carried him for 9 months, who had walked the floors with him all night when he had colic as a baby, who had sold her own mother's jewelry to help pay for his college tuition. That indifference hurt more than any insult. "All rise," the bailiff announced as the judge entered the room. Judge Gregory was a man in his 60s, with perfectly combed gray hair and gold-rimmed glasses. He had the expression of someone who had seen too many families destroy each other over money. He sat, adjusted his papers, and the hearing began. Miss Shaw opened the case with a perfectly constructed narrative. She spoke of Ryan as a devoted son who had been unjustly stripped of his inheritance by a will drafted under questionable circumstances. "Your Honor," she said in a clear, professional voice, "my client is the only son of the late Arthur Miller. Throughout his life, he was an exemplary son. He visited his parents regularly, supported them emotionally, was present for every important moment." I had to bite my tongue to stop from yelling that it was a lie. For the last 3 years, Ryan had been absent more than present. But Ruth put her hand on mine under the table, reminding me to wait my turn. "However," Miss Shaw continued, "after his father's death, my client discovered that he had been almost completely excluded from the inheritance. Everything was left in the hands of Mrs. Margaret Miller, a 72-year-old woman with no business experience, no formal education in administration, and without the necessary skills to manage a company worth over $5 million. $5 million. It was the first time I had heard that figure spoken aloud. Arthur and I had built something worth $5 million, from a single old truck to this. And now my son wanted to take it all. Your Honor, the lawyer pulled several documents from her briefcase. We have evidence that Mrs. Miller has been making questionable financial decisions since her husband's death. She has rejected lucrative buyout offers for the company. She has held on to properties that could be sold for significant profit. And most worryingly, she has been refusing to consult with her son, the natural heir, on any important decisions. It was all lies. I hadn't rejected any offers, because I hadn't received any. I held the properties because they generated steady income for the company. And the reason I didn't consult with Ryan was that he had never asked about the business until he found out how much money was involved. Then they called the first witness. He was a man who introduced himself as a financial advisor, someone who had supposedly worked with Arthur. I had never seen him before in my life. He testified that Arthur had expressed concerns about my mental capacity in the last months of his life. He said his wife was confused, forgetting important things, having difficulty understanding basic financial concepts. He lied brazenly under oath. Ruth stood up immediately. Objection, Your Honor. This witness never worked with Mr. Arthur Miller. He does not appear in any company documents. There are no records of payments in his name. There are no emails or correspondence proving he had any contact with the deceased. Judge Gregory frowned and looked at Miss Shaw. Do you have proof that this witness did, in fact, work with Mr. Miller? The lawyer hesitated for a split second, barely perceptible, but I saw it. He worked as an external consultant, Your Honor. Not all consultants appear on the official payroll. The judge didn't look convinced, but he allowed the testimony to continue. The supposed advisor kept lying, saying that Arthur had mentioned several times that he wanted Ryan to take control of the company, but that I had manipulated him to change the will. When that witness finished, they called another, and then another, each one with a different story, all of them painting me as a senile, manipulative, incapable woman. I wondered where they had found all these people willing to lie under oath. Then I remembered Ryan and Genevieve's debts. When you owe that much money, finding people to lie for you is just a matter of paying them. Finally, after 2 hours of false testimony, the moment I had been dreading arrived. Miss Shaw called Ryan to the stand. My son walked with a steady gait, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. Then he sat down and looked directly at me for the first time all morning. His eyes were filled with something it took me a moment to identify. It was resentment, pure and simple resentment. Mr. Miller, his lawyer began in a soft, almost motherly voice, tell us about your relationship with your mother. Ryan sighed as if it pained him to speak of it. My mother was always very controlling, he said, and every word was like a knife in my heart. Even when I was a kid, everything had to be her way. My father was always working, so she was the one who really ran the house. That was a lie. I had been strict when necessary, like any mother, but never controlling. I had supported Ryan's every decision, every dream, every plan. When my father got sick, Ryan continued, his voice taking on a perfectly rehearsed victim tone, she wouldn't let me be alone with him. She was always there, monitoring every conversation, controlling who could visit and when. I understand why now. She was making sure my father would change his will in her favor. That's not true, I shouted, unable to stop myself. The judge banged his gavel. Order in the court. Mrs. Miller, you will have your chance to speak. For now, you must remain silent, or I will have you removed. I bit my lip until I tasted blood. Ruth squeezed my hand hard. Ryan kept talking, building a narrative where I was the villain and he was the poor son who had been robbed by his own greedy mother. He talked about how I had cut off all contact with him after Arthur's death, how I refused to answer his calls or meet with him. He omitted the part where he had stopped visiting me first, that his only calls were to demand money, that the only meeting we had ended with his wife calling me a leech. My mother never worked a single day in her life, Ryan said, with a conviction that made me wonder if he actually believed his own lies or if he was just such a good actor he could fool himself. Everything we have was built by my father. He was the genius, the hard worker, the visionary. She was just a housewife, and now she's pretending to control an empire she didn't build, doesn't understand, and is destined to destroy through her own ignorance. Every word was like venom dripping into my ears. Is this how my son saw me? Is this how he remembered his childhood? Did he not remember the nights I spent ironing his clothes so he'd look nice for school? Did he not remember that I sold the only gold ring my mother had left me to pay for his summer camp? Did he not remember that I worked cleaning houses, on my knees on other people's floors, so his father could buy that first truck? And now, Ryan's voice broke with an emotion that would have seemed genuine if I didn't know the truth. I'm here because I have no other choice. My mother has become irrational. She spends money on unnecessary things. She rejects advice from professionals. And what's most worrying is that she's showing clear signs of mental decline. She forgets conversations. She confuses dates. Sometimes she doesn't even remember if she's taken her medication. That's when I lost it. I shot up from my chair so fast it fell backward with a crash that echoed through the room. Liar! I screamed with all the strength in my lungs. How dare you? How dare you invent those lies about your own mother? Judge Gregory banged his gavel repeatedly. Mrs. Miller, this is your final warning. Sit down immediately, or I will have you removed from this courtroom. Ruth pulled me down by the arm, whispering urgently in my ear. Margaret, control yourself. This is exactly what they want. They're trying to make you look unstable. Don't give them what they're looking for. I sat down, trembling with rage and pain. Ryan looked at me with an expression that could have passed for concern if I hadn't seen the hidden satisfaction in his eyes. He was enjoying this. My son was enjoying watching me suffer. Miss Shaw used my outburst perfectly. As you can see, Your Honor, Mrs. Miller is exhibiting erratic and irrational behavior. She cannot control her emotions, even in a formal setting like this court. How can we trust her to make rational decisions about millions of dollars and the future of 50 families who depend on that company? Then Genevieve was called to the stand. She swore to tell the truth with her hand on the Bible, and I wondered if the book would burst into flames from the contact with such falsehood. She sat with perfect posture, crossed her legs elegantly, and began her performance. My mother-in-law has always treated me with hostility, she said in a soft, victim-like voice, from the day I met Ryan. I think she couldn't accept that her son had his own life, his own family. I tried to get close to her many times. I'd invite her to dinner. I'd call her. I'd send her flowers on her birthday. But she always rejected me with coldness. Lies. All lies. I had welcomed her into my home with open arms. I had tried to know her, to understand her, to love her like a daughter. But she had always looked at me with those calculating eyes, evaluating, measuring, planning. After my father-in-law passed away, Genevieve continued, and now her voice adopted a tone of deep sadness. The situation got worse. Margaret became paranoid. She accused us of only wanting the money. She would scream at us when we tried to visit. One time, she even threatened to call the police if we didn't get off her property. That part had happened, but she conveniently left out that they had shown up unannounced, with a notary, demanding I sign papers that would give them power of attorney over my bank accounts. Of course I kicked them out. Any sane person would have. What worries me most, Genevieve said, looking directly at the judge with eyes glistening with perfectly timed fake tears, is that Margaret is putting Arthur's legacy at risk. He worked his entire life to build that company. And now it's in the hands of someone who knows nothing about business, who refuses to listen to advice, who is letting it all deteriorate out of sheer pride and stubbornness. Judge Gregory was taking notes as Genevieve spoke. I tried to read his expression, but it was impossible. He was a professional who had perfected the art of not showing what he was thinking. When Genevieve finished her testimony, she returned to her seat next to Ryan, who took her hand in a gesture of support that made me sick. Miss Shaw approached the judge's bench with the confidence of victory. Your Honor, we have clearly demonstrated that Mrs. Margaret Miller lacks the mental capacity and the necessary experience to manage an estate of this magnitude. We have shown that her behavior is erratic, that her decisions are questionable, and that she represents a real risk to the economic well-being not only of my client, but of the 50 families who depend on that company. She took a dramatic pause. Therefore, we request that Mrs. Miller be declared incompetent to manage the inheritance, that she be removed as executor of the will, and that all assets be immediately transferred to my client, Ryan Miller, who, as the only son and rightful heir, has the legal and moral right to receive what his father built. The judge nodded and looked toward our table. Does the defense wish to present its case? Ruth stood up slowly, with the calm of someone holding a winning hand. Yes, Your Honor, and it will be brief, because the truth doesn't need to be complicated. My heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone in the room could hear it. This was the moment. Ruth began in a clear voice. Your Honor, everything you have heard this morning is a carefully constructed narrative based on lies, false witnesses, and emotional manipulation. The truth is much simpler and is documented in the original will of Arthur Miller, a document that was drafted with full mental lucidity, certified by doctors, and witnessed by public notaries. She pulled a folder from her briefcase. But before we get into legal details, I would like Mrs. Margaret Miller to share something with this court, something her son has clearly forgotten or chosen to ignore. Margaret, please take the stand. I stood up on trembling legs. I walked to the stand, feeling the weight of all those eyes on me. The bailiff had me swear to tell the truth. I put my hand on the Bible and swore, knowing that every word I was about to say was true, even if it hurt, even if it destroyed my son, even if it ended any chance of reconciliation. I sat down and looked Judge Gregory directly in the eye. Your Honor, my name is Margaret Miller. I am 72 years old. I was married to Arthur Miller for 45 years until his death 6 months ago, and I am here because my only son is suing me for money he believes belongs to him. My voice sounded firmer than I expected. Ruth had prepared me for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare me to look my son in the eye as I destroyed his lies one by one. My son says I never worked. That is a lie. I worked cleaning houses for 10 years so his father could buy his first truck. I worked in the company office for another 20 years, doing the bookkeeping, handling clients, organizing routes. I don't have a college degree in business, that's true. But I built this company alongside my husband, brick by brick, with my own hands. I saw Ryan's jaw clench. Genevieve was whispering something in his ear, probably telling him to stay calm. My son says I have excluded him from my life after his father's death. That is also a lie. He stopped visiting me long before that. The only times he has called me in the last 6 months have been to demand money. My son says I show signs of dementia, that I forget things, that I am irrational. That is completely false. I took a folder from my bag that Ruth had given me that morning. I have medical reports here from the last 3 months. Complete cognitive exams performed by 3 different neurologists. They all certify that I am in full command of my mental faculties. My memory is perfect. My judgment is clear, and I am more than capable of making my own decisions. Judge Gregory held out his hand, and the bailiff took the documents to him. I watched as he reviewed them carefully, his eyebrows raising slightly. These are very thorough reports, he commented. Why did you decide to have these exams, Mrs. Miller? Because my lawyer warned me this would happen, I replied, looking directly at Ryan. She told me my son would try to declare me incompetent to steal what his father left me. So I prepared. I made sure I had all the necessary documentation to prove that I am perfectly sane and capable. Ruth then approached with another folder. Your Honor, we also have the company's financial statements for the last 6 months. Since Mrs. Miller took full control, the company has increased its profits by 22%. She has closed 3 major new contracts. She has improved working conditions for the employees, and she has maintained 0 debt. For someone supposedly incompetent, those are extraordinary results. I saw Miss Shaw's face turn pale. They clearly hadn't expected us to have such thorough documentation. The judge reviewed the financial statements with a growing look of interest. These numbers are impressive, he admitted. Mrs. Miller, how did you achieve this growth? By listening to the people who actually know the business, I answered honestly. The managers my husband trained for years. The drivers who have been with us from the beginning. I don't pretend to know everything, Your Honor. But I know how to recognize talent and loyalty when I see them. And I know my responsibility isn't just to protect the money, but to protect the 50 families who depend on this company to survive. Then Ruth dropped the bomb I had been waiting for. Your Honor, there is something the plaintiff and his counsel do not know about Arthur Miller's will. Something that changes this case completely. She took out a thick document and placed it in front of the judge. This is the complete will, not the summarized version that was read after the funeral. It contains specific clauses that were never publicly disclosed. The judge took the document and began to read. The silence in the room was so deep I could hear my own breathing. I watched the judge's eyes move from line to line, his expression gradually changing from neutral to surprised, and then to something that looked like respect, mixed with sadness. "This is extraordinary," the judge muttered, more to himself than to the room. He then looked up and stared directly at Ryan. "Mr. Miller, did you know about this clause in your father's will?" Ryan looked confused. "What clause, Your Honor?" "I read the will. Everything was left to my mother with some vague promise that I'd get my share when it was appropriate." "There's more to it than that," the judge said in a grave voice. "Much more." He looked at Ruth. "Do you want to explain, or would you prefer I read it aloud?" Ruth looked at me, and I nodded. It was time for the whole truth to come out. "Allow me," Ruth said, taking the document. Her voice filled the room with the words Arthur had written, knowing exactly what was going to happen. The will of Arthur Miller. Special clauses drafted 2 weeks prior to his death. I, Arthur Miller, being of sound mind and body, as certified by the doctors present, do hereby establish the following. All my assets are to be placed in a trust managed by my wife, Margaret Miller. My son, Ryan, is not excluded from this inheritance, but his access to it is conditional. Ryan leaned forward in his chair, finally paying full attention. "The conditions are these," Ruth continued. "Ryan will receive his inheritance when he fulfills any of the following requirements. First, that he demonstrates for a minimum period of 2 years that he can hold a stable job and live within his means without accumulating gambling debts or irresponsible loans. Second, that he shows genuine respect toward his mother and acknowledges the sacrifice both his parents made for him. Third, that he demonstrates a real interest in the well-being of the company and its employees, not just in its monetary value." Ryan's face had gone from confusion to horror. "But there is an additional clause," Ruth said, her voice turning harder. "A clause Arthur hoped never to use, but which he included as a precaution. And I quote directly, 'If my son Ryan sues his mother, takes her to court, attempts to declare her incompetent, or in any way uses legal means to try and strip her of what I have left her, then he automatically and irrevocably forfeits all right to any part of my estate. In that case, Margaret will have absolute authority to dispose of all assets as she deems appropriate, including full donation, if she so chooses." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched the color drain from Ryan's face. I saw Genevieve half rise from her chair in disbelief. I saw Miss Shaw close her eyes, knowing she had just lost the case before it ever really began. "No," Ryan whispered. "That can't be real. My father wouldn't do that." Judge Gregory held up the document. "This will was drafted before 3 public notaries, 2 doctors who certified Mr. Miller's mental capacity, and was legally registered. It is completely valid." I stood up from the stand then. Ruth had told me this was my moment. The moment to say the 3 words that would change everything. I walked to the center of the room, looking my son directly in the eyes for the first time with absolute clarity about who he really was. "I inherited nothing," I said, my voice clear and strong, echoing in every corner of that room. The 3 words I had rehearsed, that I had dreaded saying, but now came out with absolute certainty. Everyone stared at me, uncomprehending. Judge Gregory frowned. "What do you mean by that, Mrs. Miller?" I took a deep breath before continuing. "I mean exactly that, Your Honor. I inherited nothing. My husband did not leave me his fortune. What my husband did was put me in charge of protecting his legacy until his son proved himself worthy of receiving it. I am not the owner of those $5 million. I am the guardian, the protector, and my job was to wait and see what kind of man my son would become when faced with the temptation of easy money." I saw Judge Gregory begin to understand. I saw something in his expression change, as if he were seeing the brilliance of Arthur's plan for the first time. "Your husband created a test," he said slowly. "A test of character." I nodded, feeling the tears finally start to roll down my cheeks, but making no attempt to stop them. "Exactly. Arthur knew that money changes people. He wanted to know if his son valued his fortune or his family more. He wanted to know if Ryan would be able to wait, to respect, to trust, or if he would immediately run to the courts to take by force what his father wanted to give him with love. I turned to Ryan, who now had his head in his hands. And now I have my answer. Now I know what you chose, son. You chose the money. You chose to believe a woman you've known for 3 years over the mother who raised you for 45. You chose to humiliate me in public, to declare me incompetent, to destroy my reputation. And because of that choice, by bringing this case to court, you have activated the clause your father dreaded having to use. Ryan's head snapped up, his eyes red, though whether from rage or tears, I couldn't tell. "This is a trap," he shouted, jumping to his feet. "It's a cruel trap. My father set me up so I could never get what's mine." His voice was breaking with every word, but I no longer felt pity for him, only the terrible weight of the truth that Arthur had seen long before I had. "It wasn't a trap," I said, my voice firmer than I felt inside. "It was an opportunity to prove that you had learned the values we tried to teach you. Your father loved you so much that he was willing to risk his entire legacy just to give you one last lesson about what really matters in life. Not money, not power, but character, integrity, respect." Judge Gregory banged his gavel, demanding order, because Genevieve had also stood up, screaming that this was all a conspiracy, that Ruth and I had forged documents, that we had manipulated the will after Arthur's death. But her voice sounded desperate, like someone watching their house of cards collapse in front of their eyes. "Order!" the judge roared, with an authority that made everyone fall silent instantly. "Sit down immediately, or I will clear this courtroom." Genevieve and Ryan slumped back into their chairs. Miss Shaw had her head down, frantically shuffling through papers as if she could find some legal escape from this disaster. Ruth used the moment to present more evidence. "Your Honor, there is something else the court needs to know. Something that explains why Ryan needs this money so desperately." She pulled out another folder, this one filled with the documents I had reviewed weeks ago, but which still pained me every time I saw them. For the last 3 years, Ryan Miller has accumulated gambling debts totaling $243,000. We have records from casinos, receipts from private lenders, and bank statements showing constant withdrawals and deposits that do not correspond to any known legitimate income. Ruth placed documents on the judge's desk one by one, painting a devastating picture. Ryan was as pale as a ghost. Additionally, Ruth continued, without mercy, his wife, Genevieve, has credit card debts of $162,000. Together, they owe over $400,000 to various creditors. Some of those creditors are not exactly legitimate banking institutions. We have identified at least 3 loans with organizations that could be described as predatory lenders with connections to criminal activities. Judge Gregory looked at the documents with an increasingly serious expression. "Are you saying the plaintiff and his wife are being pressured by criminals to pay these debts?" Ruth nodded. "Exactly, Your Honor. This lawsuit was never about inheritance rights or genuine concern for Margaret's well-being. It was a desperate attempt to get fast cash to pay off dangerous debts." "That's not true," Genevieve shouted, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're making all this up to make Ryan look bad." Ruth turned to her with a look that could cut steel. "Would you like me to bring the lenders in as witnesses? Because several of them would be happy to testify about the missed payments and the threats they've made. In fact, we have recordings of phone calls where they discuss exactly that." Genevieve fell silent, finally defeated. Ryan had his head in his hands again, his shoulders shaking. I didn't know if he was crying or just trying to disappear. Part of me, the part that was still his mother, wanted to go to him, to hug him and tell him everything would be okay. But the other part, the part Arthur had prepared for this moment, knew I needed to see this through to the end. "There is one final piece of evidence," Ruth said, and her voice now held a note of genuine sadness. "Something Margaret didn't want us to present, but I insisted because the court needs to see the full picture." She took out a manila envelope and extracted several photographs. These are photographs taken by a private investigator over the last 3 months. They show Genevieve Miller in the company of another man, not her husband, entering hotels, expensive restaurants, always paid for with credit cards that are in both of their names. The photographs were passed from hand to hand until they reached the judge. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. There was Genevieve, laughing with a younger man, entering a luxury hotel, her hand on his back with a familiarity that left no doubt. The dates on the photos corresponded to days when she had told Ryan she had work meetings or family commitments. Ryan finally looked up as the bailiff placed the photographs in front of him. I saw the exact moment his world fell apart. I watched him look at each image, his face shifting from disbelief to recognition, and then to total devastation. He turned slowly toward Genevieve, who was now staring at the floor, with no defense possible. "Genevieve?" His voice was just a broken whisper. "What is this?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. There were no words that could explain the inexplicable. There were no excuses that could justify the unjustifiable. Her silence was answer enough. "Your Honor," Ruth said, retaking control of the room, "we present all this evidence not to humiliate the plaintiff, but to show the full context of this lawsuit. Ryan Miller did not come to this court because he was worried about his mother's well-being or his father's legacy. He came because he is desperate, manipulated, and trapped in a situation he created with his own bad decisions. And instead of asking his family for help, he chose to destroy it." Judge Gregory leaned back in his chair, taking off his glasses to rub his tired eyes. He had seen many horrible family cases in his career, but even for him, this seemed particularly painful. "I need a recess," he finally announced. 30 minutes. When I return, I will give my verdict." He stood and left through a back door. The bailiff announced the recess, and suddenly everyone was in motion. Ryan was still sitting motionless, staring at the photographs as if he could change what they showed just by looking at them long enough. Genevieve stood up quickly and tried to leave the courtroom, but Ryan grabbed her by the arm. "Don't you dare leave," he said, in a voice I had never heard from him before, a voice full of pain and rage and betrayal. "You stay here and face what you did. You owe me that much, at least." She ripped her arm away with a violent tug. "I don't owe you anything. You're just as guilty as I am. You're the one who agreed to sue your own mother. I just gave you the push you needed." "For the money?" Ryan asked, and now the tears were streaming freely down his face. "You did all this for money? The hotels with that man? Convincing me to destroy my relationship with my mother? All for money?" Genevieve laughed, a bitter, ugly laugh. "And why did you do it? For the love of justice? Don't be a hypocrite, Ryan. We both wanted the money. The difference is, at least I'm honest about it." She left then, her heels echoing on the marble floor like gunshots. Ryan was left alone at his table, surrounded by the wreckage of his life. Miss Shaw gathered her things quickly and left too, probably already calculating how to distance herself from this disastrous case before it affected her reputation. I slowly approached Ryan. Ruth tried to stop me, but I shook my head. I needed to do this. I sat in the chair next to him, where Genevieve had been sitting just moments before. "Mom," he said without looking at me, his voice broken in 1,000 pieces. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know how I got to this point. I don't know when I became this person." I placed my hand on his, the hand I had held when he took his first steps, that I had bandaged when he scraped his knees playing, that I had clapped for at every one of his achievements. "I don't know either, son. But I know your father saw this coming long before any of us. That's why he did what he did. Not to punish you, but to give you a chance to wake up before it was too late. But it is too late," Ryan whispered. "I've lost everything. The inheritance, my marriage, your respect, everything." I looked at him then, really looked at him, trying to find the boy he had been in the broken man who sat before me. "You haven't lost everything," I said softly. "You're still alive. You can still change. You can still become the man your father hoped you would be. But, Ryan, that has to start with you. Not with money, not with inheritances, but with looking in the mirror and deciding who you want to be." He finally looked at me, his eyes red and swollen. "Can you ever forgive me?" The question broke my heart because I didn't have an easy answer. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. "What you did today, how you humiliated me, the lies you told about me, that doesn't get erased easily. But you are my son. And that's a connection that not even you could completely break, even though you tried with all your might." The bailiff announced that the judge was returning. Ryan and I separated, each returning to our side of the room, but something had changed in those 30 minutes. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't even forgiveness. It was simply the acknowledgement of a painful truth that we would both have to carry for the rest of our lives. Judge Gregory entered with a solemn expression. He sat, organized his papers, and looked at all of us with the gravity of someone about to change lives forever. I have reviewed all the evidence presented. I have read the complete will of Arthur Miller multiple times. And I must say, in 30 years on the bench, I have never seen a document so meticulously designed, nor a situation so tragically predictable. He paused, letting his words settle in the room. Arthur Miller was not just a successful businessman. He was a man who deeply understood human nature. He saw the weakness in his son, and instead of simply disinheriting him, he gave him a test, an opportunity to prove that the values he tried to instill in him his entire life had taken root enough to withstand the temptation of easy money. The judge looked directly at Ryan. "Mr. Miller, you failed that test. You didn't just fail it. You failed it in the most spectacular way possible. You sued your own mother. You attempted to declare her incompetent with false testimony. You humiliated her publicly with baseless accusations. And you did it all while your wife was deceiving you, and you were both racking up debts you planned to pay with your family's money." Ryan had lowered his head again, unable to meet the judge's gaze. Therefore, Judge Gregory continued, his voice resonating with final authority, in accordance with the specific clauses of the will of Arthur Miller. "I declare that Ryan Miller has irrevocably forfeited all right to any part of his father's inheritance. The lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice, meaning it cannot be filed again. And Mrs. Margaret Miller maintains complete authority over all assets of the estate to dispose of them as she deems appropriate." The gavel struck the desk with a sound that signaled the end of everything. There were no shouts, no protests, just a heavy, definitive silence. Miss Shaw had disappeared during the recess and never returned. Genevieve was gone too. Ryan was left alone in his defeat, surrounded by the consequences of every bad decision he had made for the last 3 years. I left the courthouse with Ruth by my side. The sun was shining outside, a cruel contrast to the darkness of what had just happened inside. "You did it," Ruth said, putting a hand on my shoulder. "You protected Arthur's legacy, exactly as he wanted." I nodded, but I didn't feel victorious. I just felt an enormous emptiness where my family used to be. The next few days were strange. News of the trial had leaked in the business community. Some called to congratulate me, others just to gossip. I ignored them all. I shut myself in the house Arthur and I had built together, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to truly grieve. Not just for my husband, but for my son. Because even though Ryan was still alive, the son I knew had died somewhere during those last 3 years. 2 weeks after the trial, I made a decision. I called Ruth and asked her to set up a meeting with the company's senior managers and employee representatives. When everyone was gathered in the conference room Arthur had used for decades, I explained my plan. "The company is worth $5 million, I began, looking at the faces of the people who had worked faithfully beside my husband for years, and after much reflection, I have decided what to do with it. I am going to create a trust that will ensure the company continues to operate, that all of you keep your jobs, and that the profits are distributed fairly among everyone who contributes to its success." I saw surprise on their faces. "Additionally," I continued, "I am going to donate $2 million to organizations that help people with gambling addictions and victims of financial abuse. I will do it in Arthur's name, because I know he would have wanted his legacy to help prevent other families from going through what we went through." One of the oldest managers, a man named Caesar who had worked with Arthur from the beginning, raised his hand. "And what about you, Mrs. Miller? What will you do with the rest?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. "With the rest, I'm going to live. Modestly. Just as Arthur and I always lived. I don't need mansions or luxuries. I need peace. And the knowledge that I honored the final wish of the man I loved for 45 years. 1 month after the trial, Ryan showed up at my door. I hadn't spoken to him since that day in court. He looked different, thinner, with deep dark circles under his eyes, wearing simple clothes instead of his expensive suits. "Can I come in?" he asked in a barely audible voice. I let him in, and we sat in the same living room where we used to watch movies when he was a boy. "I divorced Genevieve," he said after a long silence. "Or rather, she divorced me the moment it was clear there would be no money. She disappeared with that man from the photographs. Didn't even leave a note. I didn't say anything. I just waited for him to continue. I sold everything I owned to pay the most urgent debts. My car, my furniture, my expensive clothes, everything. And I still owe almost $100,000. Money I'll probably never be able to repay. "Why are you here, Ryan?" I finally asked. He looked at me with eyes that finally seemed to see reality clearly. "Because I need to tell you something. Something I should have said months ago. You were right. Dad was right. I became someone unrecognizable. I let greed, and Genevieve, and my own weaknesses turn me into a monster capable of destroying his own mother for money." The tears were streaming down his face now, genuine tears of remorse that no performance could fake. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, because I know I don't deserve it. I'm not here to ask for money, because I know I lost that right forever. I'm just here to tell you that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every cruel word I said in that courtroom. I'm sorry for every lie I told. I'm sorry for wasting the last lesson Dad tried to teach me." I felt something inside me begin to soften, but not completely. The pain was still too fresh, the betrayal too deep. "I appreciate you coming to say this," I replied carefully. "But Ryan, words are easy. True repentance is shown through actions over time, not with an apology in a moment of desperation." He nodded, wiping his tears on the back of his hand. "I know. That's why I'm not asking you to forgive me now. I'm just telling you that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to become the man Dad hoped I would be. The man you and he deserved as a son. Even if it's too late to get back what I lost, it's not too late to change who I am." He got up to leave, but before he reached the door, he turned back one last time. "One more thing, Mom." "Thank you." I frowned, confused. "Thank you for what?" "For not giving up on Dad's will. For being strong enough to do what he asked, even though it meant losing me. Because if you had given me that money when I demanded it, I would have ended up dead or in jail. By denying me, even though it doesn't seem like it now, you probably saved my life." He left then, and I was alone again in that house full of memories. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of defeat, but the silence of resolution. Arthur had been right about everything, about Ryan, about Genevieve, about what money can do to people, and he had left me the tools to protect his legacy and perhaps without knowing it, to save our son from himself. 6 months later, the company was still growing. The employees worked with renewed pride, knowing they were part of something bigger than just a business. The families who depended on those salaries could sleep peacefully. And the name Arthur Miller had become synonymous with integrity in our community. Ryan got a job as a truck driver, the same job his father had done 45 years ago when he started. I saw him occasionally, always from a distance, always with that look of humble determination of someone rebuilding his life from scratch. We hadn't spoken again since that day in my living room, but I kept up with him through other people. I heard he was paying off his debts, little by little. I heard he had started attending meetings for people with gambling addictions. I heard he was living in a small apartment and that every penny he earned went toward what he owed or his basic needs. One evening, while looking through old photographs of Arthur and me, I found one last letter he had hidden between the pages of our wedding album. It was addressed to me, with instructions to open it only after it's all over. With trembling hands, I broke the seal. "My dearest Margaret," it said in his familiar handwriting. "If you are reading this, it means my plan worked, though probably at a terrible cost to your mother's heart. I know you loved Ryan more than your own life. I know that protecting him was your strongest instinct. That's why I knew I needed to make this decision for you. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I know you too well. You would have sacrificed everything, you would have given every last cent just to save our son, and in doing so, you would have destroyed him completely. Sometimes the greatest love is letting people face the consequences of their actions. It's the hardest thing a parent can do, but it's the only thing that can truly save them. I hope Ryan understands this one day. I hope he uses this second chance we gave him. And if he doesn't, at least you will know we tried everything we could. I love you beyond time and death. And even though I'm not there to hold your hand, I hope you feel my presence every time you have to make a hard decision. Because the best decisions are rarely the easy ones. Forever yours, Arthur. I folded the letter carefully and held it to my heart. Arthur was right, as always. The best legacy isn't the money you leave. It's the character you build. It's the strength you inspire. It's the love that holds firm even when it hurts. That night, for the first time since his death, I slept soundly. I dreamed of Arthur when he was young, with his bright smile and strong hands, building something beautiful from nothing. And when I woke up, I knew with absolute certainty that I had honored his memory in the only way that truly mattered. The real legacy isn't what you leave in the bank. It's what you leave in people's hearts. And money can never buy what Ryan lost that day in court, the unconditional love and respect of his mother. But it also can't buy what he finally gained, the chance to become the man he was always supposed to be. If you have ever been betrayed for money, if your own family has ever turned its back on you out of greed, remember this: dignity is not inherited, it is built. And sometimes, true love means saying no, even when it breaks your heart. Because only in the deepest darkness can we find the strength to become the light.